Welcome to another episode of Montana Shares, your opportunity to find out about the nonprofits that make our state so great. I'm your host, Bill Crane, and today I have Tal from Disability Rights Montana. Hi, Tal. How's it going?
Hi, Bill. Doing well.
Good. Let's assume, even though you've been, not you, but someone from Disability Rights has been on the show before. Let's start with the big question. What does Disability Rights do?
Yeah, so Disability Rights Montana is what's called a protection and advocacy organization. And so there's one of us in every state, and it's tied to the receipt of federal money for disability services. The state has to designate an organization like us to protect and advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. And so we provide a full range of legal services, from providing information and referral about services and legal rights, to helping people mediate disputes, all the way up to litigation in the federal courts when that's required. And then we also do other work to advance the rights of people with disabilities, including policy work at the legislature and in front of the administrative agencies and regulatory work in Montana. And then the last sort of component of that is education and outreach. And so we go throughout the state to service providers and schools and wherever sort of our clientele and our people might receive services or might be, to educate people about their rights, to educate people about the services and supports that are available in Montana.
Great. Full spectrum of stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
You work on a much smaller piece of that equation, right?
Right.
So what does the education unit do?
Right. So I run the education unit, and we have one other attorney, Kelsey Steele, who works with me. And we focus primarily on kids in public education, kids with disabilities in public education. And occasionally our work extends to higher education, but for the most part, the calls that we get relate to kids in K through 12 public education. And so what we primarily work on is ensuring that kids with disabilities are afforded their rights under federal law, under a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is sort of the key one that we enforce, and also a law called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And it's kind of interesting, they're a little bit different. The IDEA, as it's called, is a funding law, so it provides provides funds to the states to provide educational services to kids with disabilities, and it requires a sort of substantive requirement that children are provided what's called a free and appropriate public education. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot of components and was just recently interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Andrew F. To mean that the program that we provide for a child with a disability under IDEA needs to be challenging and needs to allow them to make meaningful educational progress in light of their circumstances, in light of their disability. And so there's sort of the substantive standard, and then there are all of these procedural protections that make sure that these rights are protected, that the parent's right to participate in IEP meetings and the development of the program for the child, to have information about the records and other access to information, and then finally to access an administrative review process, an administrative lawsuit, for lack of a better term, in the event that a dispute arises between the parents and the school regarding the kid's education. Section 504 is a little bit different. Section 504 is an anti-discrimination law, and so it says that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of disability in federally funded programs. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act is very similar, except that it's not limited only to federally funded programs. And so all of those three laws protect kids with disabilities in K through 12 public schools, but they have a little bit different requirements in terms of eligibility. Mm-hmm. And so that's primarily what we're working on.
Okay, so pretty much any school in Montana is probably receiving these funds. And so if you're a parent and you think that your child has some sort of a disability, what should you be doing? Yeah,
so that's a great question, Bill. So yes, every public school in Montana receives these funds and is required to comply with all three of these laws. It also applies to some extent in private schools. And so just because a child is in a private school, the parents shouldn't think, well, my child doesn't have any protections or doesn't have any access. What they should do is make sure that the child is receives a complete educational evaluation. And the way that they do that is even if the kid's in a private school, they contact their local school district, whichever school district they live in, usually by contacting the special education director or even the building principal. And it's best to do this in a written letter. We have forms on our website for how to do this. And ask for a complete or a comprehensive educational evaluation and explain, not just sort of out of the blue, I want my kid evaluated, but what is it that you see about your child that gives concern? Now, in a lot of cases, that may be a known disability. The child was born with cerebral palsy or something else. But sometimes it's that kids are exhibiting developmental or not meeting developmental milestones in the way that parents might expect, or exhibiting behaviors that are unusual, and sometimes parents don't really understand exactly what that is, but they know, well, this kiddo, he's 2 and he doesn't have any words yet, and my other kiddo who's 5, when they were 2 years old, they had a bunch of words. So any kind of question like that, I think generally the first thing to do is to talk to your pediatrician, but from there to go and have the kid evaluated at the public school. And then for kids that are under 3, that evaluation process happens through what's called a Part C provider, or an early intervention provider. And those are administered through the Department of Public Health and Human Services. And so there's a list of those at the DPHHS website, and then also through our website. And in those cases, for those young kids, you contact the Part C provider, not the school district, for that evaluation.
Okay, so what are some of the key protections that a parent should know about for a kid with IEP?
So the first thing is the right to be evaluated, or what's often called the child find requirement. The school districts and those Part C providers have an obligation by law to locate, identify, and evaluate those children. And then once they're determined eligible, and not every child that's evaluated is going to meet the correct criteria for eligibility, but once they're determined eligible, the school district needs to develop an individualized education program for the child, or that Part C provider, that early intervention provider, needs to develop what's called an individualized family support plan, which is sort of similar. And it's a legal document that says what are the issues with the child, what are their present levels, what are they doing, what are they accomplishing right now, and then what goals we have. So in that evaluation process, you'll discover, the child has some deficiencies. Maybe it's early developmental things like motor control, fine motor control, or maybe it's academic later on. They're not performing up to grade level in math or reading. The IEP develops goals for them and says, okay, so they're in 5th grade and they're reading at a 3rd grade level. Over the next year, we want them to make a 1.5 years worth of progress. So we start to close that gap. So those are the goals. And then the next thing in the IEP is how are we going to meet those goals? What services and supports are we going to provide in order to start to close that gap? And that's listed in the IEP. And then there's a description of what's called placement, which is how are we going to actually deliver those services? Are we going to do that in a general education classroom? Are they going to receive occupational therapy or physical therapy or speech language therapy for so many minutes a week, and sort of describes all that. So the first thing a parent really needs to know is that document is an agreement, for lack of a better term, between the school and the parent of what services are going to be provided. And then the parent has a lot of rights related to developing that document. First and foremost, they have a right to fully participate in the development of that IEP. They have a right to be at the meetings. They have a right to access the educational record and review all of the files that the school has on the student. And in Montana, they have a special right to provide consent to the IEP. That's different than most other states. So some states, if the parent participates in the process, that's sufficient. They don't actually need the parent to agree to the IEP. But in Montana, it's different. In Montana, you actually have to provide consent. And so one of the powerful rights that a parent has is not to provide that consent if they don't agree to everything in the IEP. And often what you want to do, what a parent wants to do is agree on everything that they are in accord with, and say, yes, we agree to these 5 services, but this other service we're not in agreement with. We want something more or something different. And if that happens, then the school can implement everything that's agreed upon, but that last piece that, that's not agreed upon won't be implemented. And then the idea is that it brings the school back to the table, and they can have a more further constructive discussion about how to solve that particular problem before it results in any kind of litigation or complaint. So that's an important one. Another important right is what's called an independent educational evaluation. And so every time a parent or the school district evaluates the student, either in that initial evaluation or they're required to do evaluations every 3 years at a minimum, then the parent has a right to say, I disagree with your evaluation, and I want to go out and get my own evaluation by a neuropsychologist or by a private speech language therapist. And the school district only really has 2 options at that point. They can either pay for that evaluation, or they can bring the parent to a hearing, to what's called a due process hearing, and say, no, our evaluation was good enough, and we don't have to pay for that. So that's important, because sometimes you need a second set of eyes, a second opinion. Those are sort of the key things that I think parents really should know going into these IEP meetings. The last thing I would say on that is there's generally no emergency where you need to sign that IEP right there and then. So parents do have a right to go home after the IEP meeting, think about it, consult with their pediatrician or their other doctors or other experts, consult with us if necessary, and then come back and say, yeah, we're okay with this IEP, or we'd like to make these modifications. So there's no real pressure to say at the end of this meeting, which sometimes only takes a couple of hours, that you have to consent to the IEP right there and then. So I think that's important for parents to know that there's time to sort of slow down and think through the process.
Mm-hmm. So do you have any guess on what kind of percentage? Is just one particular school? Is there what kind of percentage has an IEP going?
Typically, just across the state, it's around 12% of kids that are IDA eligible, and that's it's just under 12% in Montana, which is right around the national average. Mm-hmm. So in Montana, last I looked, it's roughly 17,000 students.
Okay, so this is a significant aspect of our society, to put it simply, right?
Yes, it's a huge contribution from the state, federal, and local level in terms of funding, but it recognizes, I think if you read IEDEA, it was really created in response to what was a significant civil rights issue, which was the outright removal of people with disabilities from the public school system and often into institutions that were, in some cases, providing really deplorable treatment. Congress was shocked by this. There was a major expose in 1970 to 1973, and the P&A system was created as a result of this expose, as was IDEA, which was really showing the condition of children at the Willowbrook State School in New York. And it was really terrible conditions. They were sitting on the floor, eating slop, not receiving any type of educational services. So in response to that, there was a series of court cases and then ultimately the IDEA. And I think that's why there are so many procedural protections, as well as this very core substantive requirement of the free appropriate public education, because Congress clearly did not want to go back to the time when it was legal for children to be excluded.
Mm-hmm. And so we've got this 17%, mm-hmm. and I've personally had experience in this arena. This works most of the time, right?
Yeah.
It really helps out these kids that need the help. Mm-hmm. And so if you had to guess, if people are having trouble with their education plan, they do need to, they're by law required, the schools are by law required to make it work, right?
Right, and I think that's true. And there's 17,000 students in Montana, on IDA eligible students, and we don't get anywhere near that number of calls. Right. And so I think that does to some extent show us that in a vast majority of cases, the school's doing what they need to be doing. And I always think it's important to recognize that we're a civil rights law firm, and so we're seeing cases where everything else has gone wrong, and every opportunity to sort of resolve the dispute in an amicable or collaborative fashion has failed, to the point where somebody feels they need to call an attorney. And so our perspective is not necessarily reflective of the system as a whole. The system as a whole, I think, is functional, and I think we would be on the same side as many educators and educational administrators in saying that it's underfunded. And so the
Right.
pressure in the system is really is that there's a lot of kids with needs, and there's pressure on administrators to try to meet those needs in compliance with the law and in compliance with, I think, good educational practice, without a lot of resources, without a lot of financial resources to do that. But I would agree. I mean, I think in a large part, many students are properly served. I think a lot of the challenges we see, a lot of the clients that we see are kids with either low incidence disabilities, things that don't come up all that often, or disabilities that pose particular challenges for educators. Things like really intense behavioral needs, like kids with on the autism spectrum that have intensive behavioral needs, or kids with serious mental health issues that also have pretty serious behavioral needs, and those are hard to manage in the classroom. And so I think those are the points where we often see conflict.
Okay, so we're probably going to wrap up here, but your website's probably the best place for people to start with. And then if they aren't getting questions answered, they can contact you guys, is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. We take calls, currently we take live intakes from everybody who calls in the education unit. And so they can call us, they can visit our website, and then on the top right corner there's a box for education. So there's a ton of resources. And then we also have this educational rights handbook, which we tried to write in plain English, which is a really good place for parents to sort of start and read through. And then there are one other resource I would tell them. There's a book called From Emotions to Advocacy, which is written by Pete Wright and Pam Wright. And it's really like the leading book on how to advocate for a child with a disability for a parent. It's really written in plain English as well, and it's a great resource.
Okay. Yeah. Well, super. Well, thanks for coming on the show today.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much for the work that you guys do over there. And thank you guys for tuning in as always, and I appreciate your time watching the show. Have a good evening.